Underwood. I've been with the reserve since, 2008. Started as an education assistant, became our education coordinator for a few years, and then moved up into management, which I don't know. Sometimes I ask myself, was that a good thing or a bad thing? It certainly means that I'm stuck behind a desk more often and not with people or with students as much as I like to be. So I'm very happy to be able to be here today and speak with you, because this is one of the things I enjoy doing, is getting to meet people and talk about the reserve and what the reserve system is. So let's see if I can make this work. Ta-da! It works. So if you're not familiar with the National Estuary Research Reserve, it is now, and I say now because it's grown since it started from one reserve, it is now a network of 30 coastal sites around the coast of the U.S. And these sites are state-federal partnerships. So NOAA is our federal partner with all of the reserves, and these reserves receive 70% of their funding through NOAA. And I see some looks. Yes, I know it's been a rough couple of weeks. I'm not going to lie. And then in Alabama, our state partners, the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. These reserves were established through the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972 to do research on our coastal resources and our estuaries. So estuaries are all over the world, not just here in the United States. We tend to say that they're areas where rivers and the ocean meet and mix. So Weeks Bay is an estuary. Mobile Bay is a large estuary. Pensacola Bay. You think of like a lot of these bay systems where you have rivers coming in. But estuaries are not just this fresh and saltwater systems. Estuaries also are like our Great Lakes, because they have rivers running into these larger bodies of water. And all of our estuaries serve as nurseries for fish, and then here shellfish as well. So just to give you a sense of where these estuaries are located around the coast, notice we have 5 along our Gulf Coast. In Louisiana, where was my Louisiana? Louisiana is like, they are almost across the line on their designation of a reserve, and they have been working for probably a couple of decades trying to get one designated there. So once we have one in Louisiana, our Gulf Coast will be represented. And there's the few on the Great Lakes.
There are a lot of them on the East Coast and some on the Gulf Coast, but not much on the West Coast.
Yeah. So that is a good observation, and I'm not sure why. So, I could probably talk extensively about designation, but it tends to be a grassroots effort. You have to have a governor who's interested in designation, and you have to have local buy-in to become designated, and it takes anywhere from 5 to 7 years on average for designation. Like I said, Louisiana has been trying for years. Finally got the right political climate with their Democratic governor, who is now not there, so it's slowing down a little bit again, but they're going to make it there. But I'm not sure why.
Okay.
Could it be that it's the terrain, that the estuaries in California are smaller because it's more mountainous instead of the broad river like Mississippi or the Alabama Bay coming in and creating a large estuary?
Yeah, there may be, I've never looked at a map, and I should, and there just may be more estuary areas along that East Coast.
Right, that are larger in their physical space.
Yes.
Like the Chesapeake Bay.
Like the Chesapeake, yes. So our reserve, we manage around land-wise about 3,000 acres, but our total boundary is around 10,000 acres, because that includes the bay bottoms and some of the river bottoms. We were established in 1986. 1986, not too bad, right, for Alabama? 16th reserve as I mentioned, about 3,000 acres of.
Should we close the blinds so that shows up better?
I can also turn off one of these other lights.
Yeah, maybe turn off.
It's probably the blinds, though. I normally do have the blinds turned, the blinds closed when we're doing presentations.
So we can see your map.
Mhm. So Weeks Bay, if you, and I encourage you, go out on the deck. You can see the entirety of Weeks Bay. It is a smaller bay, a sub-estuary of the larger Mobile Bay system. The watershed is pretty small, 203 square miles, but we're in Baldwin County, and Baldwin County is the fastest growing county in Alabama. And if you drive around, you will see that. We kind of have our ups and downs when it comes to building, but we're in an upswing right now. So it is the fastest growing county since 2005, and that puts a lot of pressure on our coastal resources. As you can imagine, it puts a lot of pressure on those coastal resources. And so the importance of these areas, we know, I've mentioned that these nurseries, these marshes and estuaries serve as nursery grounds and habitats. These marshes also protect us from storm surge. As water's coming in, if you have an intact buffer of wetlands and marshes, that is slowing the energy down from that storm surge. They also filter nutrients. And then something like when I first started working, I didn't really like talking about the money aspect, but it is very important. Part is that commercial and recreational fishing and outdoor recreation contributes overall to the economy, not just in Alabama, but the overall U.S. economy. And they're huge amounts. And so when we're protecting areas like this, we're not just protecting it for the sake of protecting it. We're not just protecting it for the biodiversity, but we're also protecting it for, our way of life and for our economy. And so the mission of Weeks Bay is to advance the understanding and management of coastal Alabama's lands and waters to foster resilient communities. And I know y'all are going to talk a lot about resilience, and also healthy habitats. So it's not just the health of our bay, but it's also the health and resilience of our communities. A lot of the reserves, or all of the reserves, are doing research and monitoring when it comes to climate effects and sea level rise. We have monitoring stations out in our marsh where we're looking to see how the marshes are responding to sea level rise. And we know that sea level is rising because of different climate effects. And so our closest tide station to us is at Dolphin Island Sea Lab, about 17 miles southwest of here. And you can't dispute data, right? You can't dispute the data. I want to see if I can get it to pull up here. This is from our management plan. We work on a 5-year management plan. This is still in draft. It has not been approved yet. But over the last 56 years, this is a chart from that tide station, sea levels have risen 9.6 inches just in this area. And if you don't think that's a lot, it is when you have such flat topography. When I first started working here, I never saw flooding here at this site unless we had a big hurricane. And now we can get a strong north wind and we can just have what you call nuisance flooding. And so it makes a huge difference, and it makes a huge difference with what's going on in our environment, but it makes a huge difference too with our coastal communities and how they can prepare for these impacts. And so the resource systems do research, we do land management, but we also get out in the communities and try to work with those communities on resilience and how they can be, not just communities, cities, how they can be prepared for these impacts. So I'm hoping that our management plan is approved within the year, and it'll be online if you ever want to just see what we have in there. There's data, and it talks about all of our programs of research, stewardship, and education. So With that, I'm not going to take up all your time because I know you have a lot going on today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for letting me sit in this morning with your different speakers. But if you do have questions, I will be around this morning. Or if there's like one question right now, I'd be happy to answer anything you want to have.
When's the season to come back and see those plants?
Pitcher plants.
Mm-hmm.
So a good season for the pitcher plants. They'll start blooming late March, early April, and then all the way through the summer and into the fall. My favorite time is around September.
And why do we want to come see them?
Why do you want to see pitcher plants? I'm glad you asked. Pitcher plants are they're actually my passion. That's what I studied when I went to college. We want to see them because they're carnivorous and they are in these habitats that are one of the most biodiverse habitats in the world.
In the world.
In the world. Yes. And they're just amazing. And I tell my students when I have them out there that Mother Nature is weirder than science fiction when you're looking at these carnivorous plants. Yes.
What's going on with the NOAA?
With the NOAA. The poor NOAA doesn't even know what's going on with the NOAA right now. And so I will tell you, I was just at a meeting this last week of reserves from the Gulf Coast and the Southeast reserves, North Carolina, South Carolina. It's a little disheartening trying to talk about what we will be doing, and what we will be doing, unless our funding is just totally cut, is continuing to do the good work we do within our communities. We may have to change the name of what we're doing. Okay. We may not be calling it climate change. And if you read our management plan, you'll see that we already don't call it climate change in there ever. We call it climate effects.
Climate what?
Effects. Because that's what administration could swallow and handle, and that's fine. We'll call it whatever we have to call it. We'll continue to do the work we do within our communities and with research and stewarding.
Well, there was something on CBS Saturday morning about something that happened there yesterday.
Yeah, so I think all of these federal organizations are having all of their data downloaded, and NOAA was one of them. And that is strictly, I think, because of climate.
And what was it that happened?
The Doge is going into these different federal departments and plugging into their computers and downloading a lot of the information.
Are you a federal employee?
So we are not federal employees. We are state employees, even though we get 70% of our funding through the federal government.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
We're a statewide network of local community-based organizations, watershed-based organizations that focus on protecting their local waterways. And we have two kind of prongs of what we do as the network. We provide resources and support and promote we have over 100 plus organizations in our network across Alabama. And we provide opportunities to highlight the work that they're doing on the local level or at the watershed basin level, and then highlight community stories and provide guidance and things like that, any kind of resources we can help with in their work on the ground. And then they're the eyes and ears in the waterways that help those of us working at the state level to figure out what policies we need to get changed or better enforced. So we also do lobbying at the Alabama legislature and other advocacy tools as needed, regulatory reforms, things like that. And I'm really excited to have 3 panelists here with us today. We had a 4th that wasn't able to be rescheduled when we had to reschedule because of the snow. But and I'm going to let them each individually introduce themselves after I do a little intro. But we do have Kyle Crider from People's Justice Council / Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. He can tell you the relationship there with those two groups. Donna Pilson from Rebuild Bay County in Florida. We're super excited to have Donna here. And then Cece Pless from Mobile Baykeeper. And Mobile Baykeeper is a close partner of the Alabama Rivers Alliance and the work that we do here. And so we have some different types of expertise. People's Justice Council works on climate justice and some energy related issues and resiliency related issues. And Donna's working in the community on the building side of things and the this sort of disaster recovery, and she can tell you more about that. And then Cece can talk about the water quality issues and some of those. So when we planned this, we talked about climate resilience and affordability. And all of those are very much intertwined. We have our traditional sort of environmental issues that we work on related to climate, many of which were spoken about with estuary presentation, sea level rise, water quality, and things like that. And then we have these, it's been really interesting because I've been working in the environment in Alabama for 20 something years now, and seeing the environmental movement really start to recognize, because of climate, this intersection of people and the environment, the intersection of the way that we need clean water. We always knew that, but we have wastewater infrastructure that's failing and being overtaxed by climate change. And we have drinking water infrastructure issues. We have communities that are getting flooded more than they used to, and communities that have always been flooded and never paid attention to. And now, hopefully, because everybody's getting flooded, they're getting paid more attention to. So all of these issues are just coming together at a head because of climate. And so I guess one of the disclaimers I want to give is we could have a panel of about 30 people, maybe 50 people, and still not cover all the issues related to climate change. Mm-hmm. And I will say, thankfully, our organization is completely privately funded, so I can say climate change all I want. But we do have a lot of partners that are suffering and scared because of what's happening. And that's my other disclaimer. So we're going to cover what we can cover with climate and try to get some of these issues and these threads pulled out so the league can wrap your work around some of these, but it won't be everything. And then the other disclaimer is when we started talking about this and planning this, it was before 3 weeks ago. And there's a lot going on now, and it is at the top of everyone's minds and hearts and concerns. And so we kept the structure and the questions of this panel pretty general so that we can kind of see where the conversation goes. And so I'm going to ask them questions and let them give answers, but then we'll give plenty of time for you guys to ask questions. And if it goes somewhere that we hadn't planned, that's okay, because there's just so much going on right now. And the context we're in now and probably will be for the foreseeable future does change a lot of the way that we have to work, but it doesn't change everything. As was mentioned before, we can't just stop and be overwhelmed, right? We have to keep doing the work that we're doing. Mm-hmm. And you guys know that as the league. We have to keep doing the advocacy. We have to keep doing the projects and we have to push back and against to the extent that we can the things that are happening. But it's hard to know exactly what buttons to push right now with all that's been thrown at us in the last few weeks. So coming together like this is a good thing, I think, to bear it all. So with that, I'm going to let each of you introduce yourselves and tell more in detail about your organizations before we kind of get started in our conversation. Go ahead.
Excuse me. I'm Kyle Crider, Program and Policy Director for Alabama Interfaith Power and Light, or ALIPL, and the People's Justice Council, PJC. And I'll be happy to tell you more about them soon.
Okay. Donna Pilson, I'm the Executive Director of Rebuild Bay County. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that serves as Bay County's long-term disaster recovery organization. So we were formed right after Hurricane Michael in October 2018, and our intent, the purpose was to assist with the long-term recovery of residents that were impacted by Hurricane Michael. But since then, we've had Hurricane Sally, we've had COVID, we've had wildfires, extreme temperatures, and tornado touchdowns. And because of that, we've, as an organization, we've had to expand our capabilities to be able to respond for our residents to those disasters as well. So we have expanded our mission to create access to critical resources, education, and advocacy to build resilient communities.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm Cece Pless. I'm with Mobile Baykeeper. We are part of the Waterkeeper Alliance, and as Cindy said, I'm a partner of Alabama Rivers Alliance and Alabama Waterkeepers Alliance. And we exist to defend and revive the waters of coastal Alabama specifically. So as you heard in the presentation at the beginning, Mobile Bay is a very special estuary. And we have all of these waters across the state that are dumping into this area. The watershed here is incredibly diverse. And Weeks Bay, Mobile Bay, all of the rivers and creeks that you all live in and near are part of our jurisdiction. Mobile and Baldwin counties are our primary area that we serve. And we spent a lot of time trying to understand what is water quality and what does it mean for an area that is so diverse, so that we could understand and really have real and measurable improvement in that watershed for, you know, a vision that we all want to see for our future and for the future generations of this area. And what that means for us is that we'll know we're successful when we see things like the oyster beds and the seagrasses recovering. People aren't afraid to eat the fish that they're catching, when they aren't afraid to jump in the water and take a swim. And then most importantly, and probably most abstract, when all of the communities, which we've identified about 14 communities that we're working with right now, those target communities, anything from you know, the transient visitor communities on Gulf Shores that come down in the summer times, to the industrial communities, to the fishermen of Isle of Battery, our Black communities in Africatown and Pritchard, the fishermen and anglers up in the Delta and Bay Minette, all of those different communities, when they come together and they're doing our work, and we don't have to exist anymore, that's when we can shut the doors. So those are all of the things that help us define what water quality is, and that's how we'll know we're successful. So that's who we are and what we're doing, and we'll get more into it.
There's some great resources here. We're so grateful for you guys spending your Saturday with us. So the way that we designed this was, the first block of questions and answer was going to be, it's going to be about the more traditional environmental focused issues, which we call climate, but they're all climate. And then the second block, we'll take a break, and then the second block will be more about the resiliency and affordability issues. They're sort of more around the built and human environment. And we have the main person that was going to focus on the traditional environmental is Mobile Baykeeper, because the other speaker had to cancel. So, but I want everybody to answer if you have an answer to any of the questions. So it's not just like that Cece didn't have to sit here and talk for an hour. So I know you guys work on climate issues and everything's related. So we're just going to throw it out there and let all of you answer as you see fit. And I can answer or provide some other comments too. And I know we have people in the room as well. We have, your husband's with the Mobile National Estuary Program, and I saw somebody with coal ash shirt on. So if y'all have anything to add and throw in, just raise your hands. And certainly the Weeks Bay folks. So the first thing I wanted to ask was just to describe what you, from your perspective of your organization's work, and you just described how you guys are really strategically thinking about this. What are the most important issues that you found in your organization that are affecting the ecosystems of the Gulf in the area that you're working in?
Oh, in relation to climate change, in particular, and I'll just say as well that we're really fortunate that about 70% of our funding is covered by private funding. So, like Alabama Rivers Alliance, we are very fortunate that we don't have to worry as much as many organizations about the current political climate and funding freeze. So we're not as controlled by some of the language, but the narrative is relevant. However, in this situation, I'm going to use some language that I think we'll all relate to. But relating to climate change and sea level rise, shoreline erosion, drowning marshes, which I'll explain a little bit if you all don't know what that means. And you all are very familiar with flooding issues. And those are all three things that, particularly as we see the climate change, sea levels rise, those are three issues that we encounter frequently in our work. And they're all interconnected, and they all relate to other issues that we deal with as well. But shoreline erosion, if any of you live on or near the water, if you frequent parks, you've probably seen the immediate effects of shoreline erosion. Our shorelines are changing drastically. Increased activity in the port contributes to that as well. But storm activity and bigger, more frequent storms, higher sea levels, all of that is going to contribute to shoreline erosion. Drowning marshes, and it sounds sort of strange that a marsh could drown considering it's a wet environment. But marshes, just like seagrass, which is under the water, they are a delicate ecosystem that needs a balance of sediment and water, and too much of one can cause it to lose that balance. So when there's too much water, when they're inundated with water, they lose their ability to function the way they should as an estuary, and they'll lose some of the species that they normally have. So oftentimes what we see is a die off of some of the seagrass populations and the grasses that help hold in the soils, for example. And those marshes aren't functioning the way they should to protect our shorelines. So again, interconnected to that shoreline erosion issue. And then flooding. Flooding kind of speaks for itself in many ways, but as you have less resilient shorelines due to some of those previous issues, you're going to see increased flooding, which can also add to sewage issues. And, Baldwin and Mobile County have a number of issues with sewage and pollution from septic and sewage overflows. I'll talk more about that, I'm sure. But
We love to talk about sewage.
yeah, poop is one of our favorite topics. Unfortunately, I mean, we live in a low water table as it is. So you can imagine that the lower we are compared to the water as it rises, it's just going to become more of an issue. I mean, and this isn't even we really, in this area, lower Alabama, on the one hand, climate change is an issue, but we're also up against other issues. Politically speaking, our state isn't doing a lot for us. You compare us to a place like Tampa, which has a larger population and also a low water table. And they're doing a lot better in terms of sewage issues than we are. So those are some of the issues. I'm kind of rambling, but
No, I mean, I would say elaborate a little on where, what's causing these? So we know that climate is exacerbating problems that we've already had for a long time with water quality and environmental issues and other, related to environmental issues. So climate change is exacerbating it, but there's other factors involved that are making these things happen or contributing them that we can, it's hard to say we can't solve climate change, but we can get at these things different ways. So what are some of the causes of shoreline erosion and the drowning marshes and the things that you talked about? What's making that happen directly?
So unfortunately, there are a lot of human causes to some of these issues. Taking shoreline erosion as an example, a lot of the issues that a lot of the things that we do as a population to try and steward our shorelines, unfortunately, have the opposite effect. So are you all familiar with what bulkheads are?
Yes.
We refer to them often as hardened shorelines. Any hardened shoreline, which you see all over Mobile Bay, all up in the Fowl River, Fish River, Dog River, I'm sure up in the Weeks Bay area, which connects up to Fish River. These areas, these watersheds all have what we refer to as these hardened shorelines, which short term feel like a good solution to shoreline erosion. You put a wall up, it stops the dirt and everything from falling into the water. Unfortunately, what really is happening over time is that think of like the bathtub. When you're sitting in a bathtub or when your kid's sitting in the bathtub splashing around, water hits the side of the tub and it splashes right back. So we call it a bathtub effect. So in the bay, we have these big ships that are coming in and they're only getting bigger, they're only going faster, which means waves are bigger, and the wave energy that is being created is going to be bigger and bigger and more dramatic. And as it hits those hardened shorelines, it just splashes right back. So all of that is causing this muddy, stirred up effect, which is not good for the bottom for a lot of reasons. And that's relating to those marshes and some of the other resiliency issues. But what also is happening is it's pulling at the bottom, and it pulls underneath the dirt and the sediment from underneath your hardened shoreline, and you kind of get the sinkhole effect on the other side. So it's not actually stopping erosion. We have done a lot of work with trying to move people towards living shorelines, which are a long-term solution for supporting a healthy shoreline that will have less opportunity. You know, they're more resilient to climate change, to storms, to wave energy. And a living shoreline is essentially, it looks more natural. You can imagine it's alive, and it actually grows and into itself. So it's plants that can root into the soil. It's rocks and all of these things. A, they absorb the waves instead of splashing them right back. But B, they're growing and changing, and they're able to adapt with the ecosystem and with the waves and the water. That sort of, as an example, answer your question. Does anyone have questions about what those are and how they operate?
The Shoreline Act, what did that do? That was a big deal in the fall. So what did that do to help people know to do that with their land or their shore property?
So in last summer, we officially passed we helped support pass the Joe Faust Living Shorelines Act, which was our first piece of environmental legislation that we got passed, which is really exciting. We had a second that we helped pass as well last year.
Did it pass statewide or?
Statewide, yeah. Which means it can help all over the state. There are a lot of shorelines up in other parts of the state, rivers, that also would benefit from this. But it in effect, it lowers the barrier to permitting for getting a living shoreline installed. So one of the reasons people choose a hardened shoreline over a living shoreline is because of permitting. It's quicker, it's easier, it's cheaper, feels like the best solution. It seems like it'll work. When in reality, long term, it'll cost you more because you have to keep replacing it. So that bill made it cheaper and easier to permit a living shoreline. But there's still the social aspect of explaining to people that it's a good idea.
Yeah, that was an amazing activity that happened there. And I don't know if other states are doing that.
I think like I said, it's a social.
Is it a good model for other states?
I certainly think so, for several reasons. I think that there are a lot of conversations that have to happen. Word of mouth, people getting engaged with issues is a big part of it, so that people, neighbors and friends of friends can know this is the right choice. But one of the reasons I think it was such a great thing is because it was a bipartisan bill. It was, Joe Faust, his name was on it, which is huge. And then Representative Jennifer Fidler was the representative who backed the bill. And so having a Republican on the ticket was huge. A lot of people see an environmental issue and they think, especially in a red state, they think, why would I care about this? But having someone who was not a Democrat, not liberal, say, this is great, this is good for you, this is good for your economy, was really important for the issue.
That's good.
One thing that's really, I'll get to this question in a second. One thing that's really exciting to see that y'all may not know that is that there are many more environmental groups than we've had in the past getting engaged in the Alabama legislature and getting lobbyists and getting, government affairs staff, Mobile Baykeeper, us, Coosa Riverkeeper, and a group called Energy Alabama. And for a long time, it's just been like one or two. And, the other lobbyists for entities that are not necessarily supportive of the environment have dozens and dozens and dozens of lobbyists there. Unfortunately, that's just a game we have to play, right? So it's exciting to see more environmental groups getting resources and ability to be able to engage in the legislative process more. And we do, and I know the league is a nonpartisan organization. That's always important to remind ourselves. And we do have as much, we get as much input or as much response from Republicans as Democrats often on some of these issues. Now that it depends on, there's a line where that doesn't go further, right? There's a line where if it's too much regulation or something there. But right now, finding these bills that everybody can agree to that baby step us in direction of having more environmental understanding among legislators is the goal. And I think that, Mobile Baykeeper's been great in starting that train with this bill.
I wanted to find out what's the difference in the effects between the hardened shoreline and the living shoreline. Why is that? I understand that the living is better, but why?
Well,
What happens?
so as I mentioned, with a hardened shoreline over time, it's actually increasing erosion. So not necessarily compared to, let's say, sand, like just a sandy beach that has no grass, no rocks compared to a seawall. I don't have the statistics to say which one of those is worse. However, a hardened sea or shoreline compared to a living shoreline is absolutely worse for erosion. It's going to cause more erosion than a living shoreline.
Because you don't have the growth to hold the land in place.
Yes, because a living shoreline absorbs a wave, whereas a hardened seawall will like bounce the wave back, which continues the energy from a wave, and that stirs up all of the dirt, all of it makes it hard for the things that hold are the bottom, the benthic environment of the bay in place, that create an ecosystem in the bay that would ultimately help prevent further erosion.
Mm-hmm.
That energy that from the hardened shoreline, it creates like too much chaos in effect for those things to survive. Does that
And also
answer your
the-
question?
Yes, thank you.
The seafood nursery, because
Yeah, that's a great addition. The benthic environment down there, all that seagrass,
Mhm.
that is what is effectively the nursery habitat as well. So
Okay, we got a question here first, and then I'll get to you.
My husband helped to write a living shorelines for property owners manual several years ago. And I'll say that you can have a sandy beach in a living shoreline if it's engineered correctly. Every shoreline's different, and so they all have to be engineered differently. But you can create a pocket beach with aggregate offshore and stuff to still have a beach and still have your plantings in different places. So it's not that you can't have a sandy beach with a living shoreline. And the manual that he wrote, which I'm sure the regulatory part of it, so it's basically a handbook for anybody who wants to put in a living shoreline, step by step, what you need to do. And the regulatory process is probably outdated on this because it was done a few years ago, so it's probably easier now. But anybody can get it. It's free to the public on the National Estuary Program's website. If you just Google Mobile Bay NEP Living Shorelines, it'll come up with the manual, and you can download it and print it. And
I was just going to ask, if somebody asked me, please describe a living shoreline, what would it look like? Would it have rocks on it? Would it have grass? You said it can have partially sandy beach. Can you just, so because I'm sure that there are lots of people who don't know what that term is.
if in the simplest terms possible, I would say if you've been to a natural beach or like a national shoreline, that's what it looks like. It's a place that has been undisturbed. That's what we're aiming for. Something that we're taking it back to its original state as closely as possible. And the way, because in actuality, a living shoreline is an engineered structure. It isn't natural. You have to engineer it for it to be successful. You have to actually build the layers. You have to make sure that, the plants are going to be able to take root. You have to build in layers of rocks and put in bits of, sand here and plant here and rock here. As Rhoda mentioned, you have to, if you want to have a pocket beach, then you have to know where to put out wave breaks. There are so many elements that are actually engineered, but what you're aiming for is that natural look. So if you've been to a national shoreline, national beach, that's the look. Does that answer your question?
Well, if I said to somebody, you're going to see a lot of rocks, a lot of growth of vegetation that can take salinity. And if there is a beach, there will be some wave breaks out so that the waves don't erode. But it's a pretty place, and a lot like the beaches in our federal parks.
Yeah, or if you wanted to use a local example, you could maybe compare something like there's the bird sanctuary down in
Gulf Shore.
Yeah, thank you, in Gulf Shores. That's what I was by Fort Morgan. That where there are plants coming down to the shoreline, but there is some sand. There might be some rocks here and there that are going to. It might not in that situation. There aren't true wave breaks, but there are. That's a beautiful example of.
There are a lot of sandbars and those.
And so you might be able to use an example that they've been to as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, because
there are also local examples of living shorelines. We have some on our website, up by like right by the causeway, between I think it's Bayfront Restaurant and Daphne. There's a big stretch of living shorelines. There's some apartments, there's a restaurant, and then there's a huge stretch of living shoreline. It's actually where we had our celebration for the bill, and it's a great example of a living shoreline. That one doesn't have any sandy beach, but it's beautiful because people can see, oh, this creatures could live here. I could imagine little critters growing up in those grasses, and if I was fishing, I would want to go fish there because there's definitely something living in those reeds.
So one thing this brings up for me is that when we think about, climate and environment and all these interactions, there's two parts to any of this environmental stuff, or anything really. It's too much. Even if we're talking about human health, it's prevention and it's remediation or mitigation, whatever you want to call it. So there's efforts to preserve land and ecosystems. Those are our parks and our public lands and our national seashores. We want to keep things as natural as we can, as long as we can, right? Because Mother Nature does a really good job of engineering things that work. And when we have to go back and re-engineer something and try to make it like Mother Nature did, it's really hard and it's really expensive. So if we can not screw it up in the first place, and most of these things, even though we call them the natural, ecosystems, and they're good for the living critters that live in them, they're also good for us because seashores, for example, do protect from storm surges, and those barrier islands that most of them are gone now. We're very much about protecting all of everything from hurricanes and storms. So the more that we can keep it the right way in the first place, it's good. So when you hear about organizations that are doing that preservation and then buying lands and things like that, it costs a lot of money, but don't poo-poo that because we need that. But we also have to sometimes go back and try to reconfigure it. And I can tell that you want to say something.
I had a question for you. So it sounds like that we're talking about living shorelines. It's intentional. And it's something that, like you said, engineered and that we have, there's efforts on our part that need to be made in order to keep that up, right? So we're actually collaborating with Florida State Panama City, their St. Andrews and St. John's Bay Estuary Program. As we look at community resilience, we're looking at it from a human system standpoint and an ecosystem standpoint and the environment. And what is it that we can do as residents to help with that, right? So, and Living Shorelines is one of the projects that we really want to engage on, where we are educating, as we bring in folks to talk about other things that like human systems, we're also educating on how to, for those that have property that does have a shoreline, to how they can plant the proper plants that they can do, put it out there to also how to, for those store owners, how those nurseries that have small nurseries, how we can get the right type of plants in those nurseries and how they sell those, how they cultivate those in order to to put some of the onus back on residents on how to keep those living shorelines together. So just looking at resilience from environmental systems as well as human systems and make it all fit together. So that's it's interesting that you say that, because I'm taking notes like, yeah, because we're right now in a collaboration to try to make that happen and make that connection. So I'm excited about that.
Well, and that ties in so much with our mission and our vision with bringing the community in to do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. That. Right, cool.
And for those of y'all that don't live on the coast, there's a few people like me here from Birmingham. As Cece mentioned, upstream in the rivers have shorelines too. Our lakes, reservoirs in Alabama have shorelines too. So these principles can apply, and I think of it more in some of the more upland river systems. You've got forests that are holding in the erosion, and people go and clear cut them and all that stuff erodes into the rivers, and we don't want that. So making sure that we're it's just applying that to all the ecosystems. I actually learned something new today, this morning, that I didn't realize estuaries apply to the Great Lakes. I thought they were just the salt and freshwater mixed areas. So that's really interesting. Kyle, did you have anything to add to this part of the discussion?
Just a brief kind of prequel to the resilience talk that we're going to be getting into. We, PJC, People's Justice Council, have a program that we call From Resilience to Restoration. And ALIPL, Alabama Interfaith Power and Light, is a partner on that. But we don't just have state partners. PJC is primarily operating in the Gulf South for this From Resilience to Restoration thing that I'm looking forward to telling you about also. But right here in the Mobile area, I'd like to give kudos to Reva in the back and Rhoda in the front, because likewise, we work with local partners. It's all about frontline communities. And so I'd invite you to talk to Reva and Rhoda and learn about what does this resilience to restoration mean right here close to home.
All right, I'm going to ask a little bit of a leading question to you, Cece, because I want to get something out of you, and also maybe I get a shameless plug about something I want to talk about. But so there have been manipulations of our water systems upstream that come into the bay, and there are manipulations in the bay, dredging being one of those. So I know that you guys have so manipulations upstream that I'm thinking of are dams, which are a big issue that we, those of us who focus on rivers, have a lot of frustrations with. And so 2 questions. One, I'd love for you to talk a little bit, if you can, about the dredging stuff. I don't know if you're at liberty to talk about a lot of that, but what that is doing and how y'all are working on that. But then also the freshwater saltwater mix of Mobile Bay. And I know I kind of want to bring up manipulations and dredging and Army Corps, because I know that's a big issue in Louisiana as well. And I think y'all's issues are a little bit different, but I know it's all still kind of the same, of manipulating natural systems, which we talked about already. But the freshwater saltwater mix of the bay, like you have all the freshwater coming down, but it's supposed to be at certain times, and the lives of the critters that live in there rely on certain mixes at certain times. Yeah. And when you dam up those rivers, you change all that. And I know we don't necessarily have all the data, what that exactly means, but just thinking about how is that whole manipulation of the system impacting the bay, and our, what are some things that we can be thinking about, like an out water plant.
Yeah.
But anyway, just
big question. Well, and also I wanted to kind of tie up the last thread a little bit too, and add on to what you said about upstream, and just say that, I mentioned increased storm activity. One of the things that, like we have these big looming threats like plant berry too.
Yeah, I was gonna get to that.
Yeah, which we'll get more into that, I'm sure. But rain and storms, like there's really no argument. Like I mentioned flooding, like all these things are happening more frequently and more dramatically, and that does affect upstream in a big way as well. Like flash flooding in Birmingham area, I know, like I grew up in Birmingham, and that has gotten worse. So erosion is certainly an issue across the state, not just down here. Just wanted to tie that up.
Which is it does manipulate the natural water systems, right? The sediment running into all the runoff from the parking lots and the clear cuts and everything. They completely alter what's supposed to be happening in there and the way the water flows, how much water flows, and what can live in those bodies of water.
And I don't mean to avoid the other question. So the big question, how are the ways that we're manipulating water impacting the
coastal, the bay,
the ecosystem in the bay? Cindy mentioned mud dumping in particular, and then dams upstream as two examples of two really big ways that of I guess human interference with our ecosystems. So I just want to say that like on a big level, like we haven't done a lot with dams. So I don't have a whole lot publicly to say about that, aside from what, 2 years now? Has it been 2 years since? Yeah, I think it's been a year and a half to 2 years.
Actually, it's the end of the feasibility study, so it's been 3.
Okay, gosh, it's been a while, but we the one public involvement we've had with dams in the state has been that the Corps of Engineers had said that they wanted to, in partnership with a few other groups, put in a fish passage around 2 dams on the Alabama River, and we basically said we wanted them to look into other options, that we were encouraging them to look into other options, that we didn't want them to jump to conclusions that was the best case scenario. And in short, the reason for that is because we want there to be studies done so that we can understand what is the impact of these structures, these human structures on these waterways. Now, I will say a fish passage is essentially a way that fish from upstream have a way to navigate around these huge man-made structures to get downstream. There are different ways that they can be implemented, but I think the way that they were looking at doing them was effectively a stream around the dam.
And they're actually supposed to go both ways. So the fish that live here spawn up in the freshwater. So they're supposed to be able to go both ways, which makes that even harder to engineer.
Yes, it's not as simple as it sounds. However, that conversation has been tabled for now. So currently, there is not going to be anything implemented on those dams. But again, the reason we said anything about those 2 dams was because we wanted them to look into all of the possibilities, including things such as dam removal or partial dam removal, to see if those might have more beneficial, long-term, environmental impacts for downstream for the bay. Whether that's things, I mentioned the drowning marshes. Sometimes removing those barriers can help with bringing more sediment down and re-nourishing those marshes. Re-nourishing just means putting dirt back into the marshes that are drowning, which helps them not drown. So there can be beneficial reasons to remove a dam, but we haven't done the research. We haven't studied it, and so we don't know. We want to see more research done on that.
Whose responsibility is it to do that research? Is it the Corps?
Well, those dams are owned by the Corps, but that's a big question.
Well, so there's a group that is. So we have been involved in dam issues for decades, particularly mostly on the Alabama power-owned dams on the Coosa and the Tallapoosa rivers and Blackwater River. They're hydropower dams, so they're different than the ones on the Alabama. The Alabama River is Army Corps of Engineer dams that you can lock through. So they have somebody operate the dams and they can open it up and boats can go through. Hydropower dams don't have even that option. You can't get around them. They do create Smith Lake and Lake Martin and reservoirs that people love and cherish here in Alabama, but they completely altered the ecosystems when they were built. So like the largest mass extinction in modern history was on the Coosa River when the 7 dams were put in on the Coosa River in the middle of the last century. And mostly that was aquatic, snails and darters and mussels and, the little fish that need the little shallower waters. But
So the Alabama sturgeon.
the sturgeon is the one on the Alabama River. And there's also, I thought it was interesting that you mentioned you asked about out west of the estuaries out west. Well, so out west, you see a lot more dam removals. And there's big dam removals on big main stem rivers. Here in Alabama, we've seen some low head dam removals on tributaries. There was one on the main stem of the Tallapoosa, but not the major ones. They're all still kind of purposed by Congress to either do flood control or hydropower or both, or navigation. They have like purposes they were designated when they were built. So in order to get those things removed, it is a huge expense. It's also an ecological, task because you've got all the sediment behind it. So it takes a lot of involvement from a lot of partners to actually do a removal if it is funded and decided to do that. But building up to that, you need research. And so the Army Corps has some responsibility to do, if they decide to do like a feasibility study like they did on Alabama, they are supposed to look at all the options. They threw dam removal off the table from the get-go.
They threw what?
So,
Dam removal out.
so you said there were some partial dam removals, right?
There have been whole dam removals, but just low, like the low head dams that maybe like were built to either, they're not being used for anything big purposes. So
Have you seen, or have we seen any kind of benefits from the
yes,
partial?
yes.
Is that something that-
for example, on the Cahaba River, there's one of the best stories they tell is Marble Slab it was actually a concrete road that was built across the river years ago. And Cahaba River is obviously a very ecologically robust system. So when they took that, but even though it was like water could flow over it because it was short, it wasn't a big high dam, but the fish couldn't get up it, and mussels and things like that. And mussels actually have to have fish to do their reproduction. So the fish carry the mussel larvae upstream, and that's how they reproduce. So the fish couldn't get past it. So that when they took that out, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife and state partners at Department of Conservation and biologists from universities all have been, I think they just celebrated, 20 years, maybe 10, I can't remember, I lose track of time. And they've done every year, they see new species, or not new species, but new, more and more successful counts of reproduction of mussels and snails and the sensitive things that upstream from there that used to not be able to.
Isn't that something that they could basically point to and say, it's done this much good, so we need to take out more?
Yeah, I don't think that the problem, they have no doubt that dam removal will result in ecological improvements over time.
Okay.
I think it's more political. And so the navigation industry has not navigated on the Alabama. I could talk all day about this, so we won't get too much more into the weeds, but they haven't navigated on the Alabama River for more than 15 years. There's been no commercial navigation, but that's what those dams were built for.
Oh, okay.
And they were supposed to bring, there's these amazing news articles from the 1950s where they were bring all this economic development to the Black Belt. And that was the purpose of putting those dams in. They're going to be able to move commercial navigation. They did have some commercial navigation. It did not bring huge economic development to the Black Belt. As you can see, that's one of our most impoverished areas of the state still. And so, but there hasn't been any commercial navigation on it in a very long time. But the navigation industry is still very politically connected and strong. And so they were at the table with this conversation about what gets studied. And there are dam operators. Is this still being recorded?
It sure is.
There are people who don't want, I think probably who don't want dam removal to catch on. Like we don't want dam removal to be something that because there are dams that are really being used for purposes that are still being used. I'll be diplomatic about this.
Good purposes.
Do people on Lake Martin and Smith Lake want their dam gone? No. I mean, and does Alabama Power going to give up their hydropower? No. And flood control. So there are reasons not to, remove them now. And so, but these particular ones, it was just to study them. And we were hoping they would study them to see what the options were. And the main purpose of the feasibility study, though, when it was allocated by Congress, was to study how to get the fish past the dam. It wasn't really a broad, how to do all the benefits of the dam. It was just how to get the fish past. And this was what was decided was the best option. But it still hasn't been approved by Congress. And like she said, it's been tabled because there's also not a state partner or any partner that's willing to be the owner of a system that's engineered. So
To
there's all
finance
these
it.
factors. Yeah, somebody's got to own it. Somebody's got to hold the liability and the cost of it, and so there's still a lot of things in the air that are not going to make it happen. But I think the point of bringing this up is that we need data to understand how these systems are working, and we need to not be afraid to study and change things that we've done in the past that maybe not of use anymore. And that is a great segue into our energy systems.
Well, can I just say one more thing? Connecting that, you mentioned, I think this will still segue, I hope. You mentioned why can't we use the example of the snails that, the fish, the darters that were saved by the smaller dam removals to encourage the larger dam removals. We need the data, the economic value that would be beneficial to bring to the policymakers, the people who, the decision makers in the state and at the federal level, things that they relate to. At the very beginning when Angela mentioned the narrative might change a little bit, the narrative has always been different when you're talking to the decision makers. We can't go to them and say, just to be frank, if they cared as much about the environment, they'd be sitting in this room. So we can't go to them and say, hey, look at the snail. We have to say, hey, look at how many dollars you could save. And then they'll be like, oh, this matters to me.
Right.
Or we have to say, your backyard just got flooded, not sea level rise is happening. That they need to understand and connect the issue for them to want to make a difference and make the change happen.
Got it.
I hope that's still said.
Yeah, and I will say that I should have said this earlier too. There is a group called Alabama Rivers and Streams Network that is made up of state and federal agencies and groups like ours and academic institutions, biologists that get together and talk about all of these, not necessarily dam removal, but other, all the species and different ecological issues. And we have started a new group kind of out of this initiative that happened. And, I know I can only speak for the Rivers Alliance, but from our perspective, we weren't prepared to launch a big fight for dam removal. When they took it off the table, we didn't have the data, we didn't have the money and the information to take, like Cece said, to say, look, this could be a good alternative. And so we've kind of been trying to figure out where, to get some of our own data. There's some efforts to map all the dams. There's maps out there, but compiling them so they're all in one place and sharing data. So there's a subgroup of the Alabama Rivers and Streams Network that is currently having its first meeting next week. And it's called, the acronym they came up with was INBOLD, which stands for In-Stream Barriers and Other Low-Head Dams. And so it will be hopefully a beginning of a conversation to talk more. There's still a lot of sensitivity to actually talk about dam removal as part of this, because there's a lot of agencies and things that are not necessarily going to just jump on that. But it's a beginning of a conversation with all the entities that need to be at the table. I think it's going to be there to talk to me.
You might be. I would have to.
So there is some forward progress, I guess, towards that.
I should also say that, just to be very clear, again, I said at the beginning, but this is not one of our big issues. I mentioned that, we made one comment and especially publicly, we're cognizant of the dams, we're aware of them, we keep a pulse on them and how they affect our ecosystem, but publicly, mud dumping is something that is our big issue. Well, I can just say that, Dr. Jazz mentioned the sturgeon, and to tie it in with, the snail doesn't make the difference, but the dollars do. One of the things, the reason we were able to make, even have any kind of opportunity to make waves with this issue. And if you're not familiar, we issued a notice of intent to sue the Army Corps of Engineers last year over the maintenance dredging of which is, after the deepening and widening of the ship channel in the Mobile Bay. In order to maintain the depth and width of that channel, they will continue to dredge, which means dig up the channel and then dump the mud into the bay. And their plan for the maintenance dredging is to use in-bay disposal, which means dump that mud into the Mobile Bay. Nowhere else in the country do they use that method. They use different methods like they build barrier islands, they do on land disposal, or they do open water disposal, all of which for a number of reasons have more beneficial use and are better for the environment. Our ecosystem, as we touched on, is fragile, is important. Seagrasses would be smothered, would not be able to reach the sunlight, which they need to grow just like any plant. Seagrass is a plant, it needs light to survive. That mud would keep it from being able to reach the light. And so that would cause die-outs of what little seagrass we have left in the bay. It could smother our oysters, which the numbers of oysters that we have left in the bay are already, over the last 60-ish years, we have seen a huge decline in our oyster numbers because of dredging. So we have been working as an organization to work on restoration of those oysters. And I mentioned, and that's one of our indicator species, both seagrasses and oysters are indicator species for water quality. They also help hold grass or dirt in place, which helps with water clarity, which helps with building ecosystems for more little creatures. All of these things are really important to our unique ecosystem in the bay. So long story short, we want to stop the plan and change it so that they will do something more beneficial with that mud that they're dredging up.
Yeah, so the mud that they're dredging up, I can see why that's a problem and how it disturbs everything. But dumping it into Mobile Bay, I know that's not good either, but why?
So Mobile Bay is very shallow.
Okay.
So, and what they're doing is called open water disposal in bay, which means they have, I should have brought the slides, I didn't, but they have like designated plots that they are aiming for, but they just basically hose out the mud into these plots.
So what does the mud do?
It just disperses and settles.
Does it mess up the seagrass also and the other?
It just settles onto everything.
Okay.
Yeah, what we'd be looking at is like over 20 years, about 2.5 inches of increased mud on the bottom.
And it's full of heavy metal.
Yeah, although that's not what we're focusing on. We're focusing on the how it would impact the benthic ecosystem. So the reason, and I got a little off track, the reason we were able to approach this issue is because the Center for Biological Diversity approached us and said, hey, this is critical habitat for a threatened species, the sturgeon. Are you interested in partnering with us? And we said yes, because that gave us teeth, basically. Now we noticed that people were like, why are you, like our communities, policymakers were like, the sturgeon, like why do we care about the sturgeon? So a few weeks ago, we were actually up in DC and we brought, more significant than our own team, we brought stakeholders, we brought, influencers, if you will. They're fishermen and guides who are out on the water every day, who see the issue, who their livelihood depends on the bay. And they're the ones who really made a difference. We, had the ears of, federal legislators, of people who can make a difference in this issue. Now, we don't have anything in writing. Nobody's said officially they're going to support us. We have a lot of enthusiasm right now, which is exciting. So we're definitely on the precipice of something. But I guess the reason I say that is because you have to bring the issue to their table. You have to show them why it matters to them. These people like sports fishing. They want to go out and be able to fish.
Is there some kind of a middle ground where they can still have the progress with the shipping industry without messing up the environment?
I'm glad you asked that question. This does not stop progress. We're just asking that they dump the mud in a different place in a different way.
Okay. Dredging it out in the first place is a message.
The shipping channel project, the deepening and widening of the ship channel, if it should be done already, or it's on schedule to finish in like March, I think. So our whole issue has to do with the maintenance after the completion of the project. So everything having to do with, progress of the port will already, like the port will be moving on. We want them to change how they're managing the maintenance of that mud.
Okay, we need to wrap up, but there's been a question right there for a long time, and I'm sorry I haven't.
I don't have a question, I have a comment.
Okay,
Scott Duncan taught at Birmingham Southern. He is now the director of Alabama Audubon. He has a new book out this year, well, last year now, called Southern Rivers, that covers, not in depth, but just covers the sturgeon, mussels, the whole thing that's happening with the river systems. It's very readable, and I recommend it.
do you know Scott's parents in
Yes,
Pensacola?
I do.
We love Scott.
Yeah.
Scott's amazing.
Yeah.
Yes, so his book is called Southern Rivers.
Southern Rivers.
And his name is Scott what?
Scott Duncan.
Duncan.
And he's actually going to be at Alabama Water Rally down here at Camp Beckwith at the end of March, speaking in a session about biodiversity.
Yeah, that would be separate.
Yes, he's great. So thank you for that. So we're going to wrap up this section, and I know we have like 2 minutes just to say an update on coal ash. Is there anything to update?
There's not a lot of update. It's a looming threat. We want them to recycle all of it, not just some of it. We want a written commitment. So if you don't know, there's the largest unlined pit of coal ash in the United States. That's 20-ish miles north of here, probably more like 35, I guess, from where we are here. All of these climate issues that we've been talking about are incredibly relevant when you have something that's that close to a river. And there's an earthen dam, it's not even.
How did Georgia get them? It's the same company.
Let's raise your hands when we have questions, because a lot of people have had questions, but also I don't know that we have too much more time.
We're gonna have to switch gears here.
Well, and I'll hang out after.
Yeah, we
so
can talk about this after.
Let me just add, we have 2 pictures back here and a handout on coal ash.
Yeah.
Perfect.
This is a statewide issue.
Yes.
And I just want to say that I promised the folks here that we would do a program on coal ash later.
Another
So
program,
this is not our only
Excellent.
discussion.
I won't go into detail on coal ash. I'll just say that there's not really a difference in our current lawsuit with Alabama Power. We want them to remove it. We hope they will. They have said that they're going to recycle some of it, but not all of it. We want them to recycle all of it. And we're waiting for some sort of written commitment about even recycling a portion of it. Continue to put pressure on
So to
them.
wrap up this section, I do want to say that, we didn't talk a lot about energy. When you think about climate change, that's where we all think about energy, and the way that we produce energy from fossil fuels predominantly still in this state and in a lot of places is one of the main drivers of, carbon in the atmosphere and climate change. And one of the things that I hoped that we would show you, and I think we did today, is that that is a huge issue, and there's a whole lot that goes into transitioning to clean energy. But water is also a major impact of climate change, and it's where we're seeing so many of the impacts that we are already having. So we wanted to kind of dive into that water side of things, so that it's because oftentimes it gets left out of the conversation when we think about carbon and energy, and not necessarily about the water impact. So it's kind of why we focused on that today, but there's definitely a lot more to go into it. One more last
I just
question.
want to ask one question that I hope will relate to later on in the day too. What things can the league do besides educating and informing? Like Cece was talking about partnering or actually supporting. We are a strong organization. How can we use that strength somehow to affect change?
That's a great question, and that is what I hope we're trying to get to that at the very end of the panel. So after we talk about the other 2 panelists and their expertise in the second segment, then the last question to everybody is going to be, what do you see that the league can do, and where are the gaps and where can the league focus? So I think we're going to take a little break right now. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that would be a good thing.
All right. So thank you all. So I want to reset a baseline expectation here. Please raise your hand if you have a question. I'll try to do a better job of noticing that. And we're going to try to repeat the question when you have one, so everybody can hear it. We've had a request for that. But try to do one question at a time so that we can get everybody's questions answered. And this section is going to be focused on resiliency and affordability, and a little more of those human systems, but still it's all related as we've talked about. And so it'll be focused more on these two. We're going to give Cece hopefully a little break because she carried the load for the last hour. And so I think what I would like to start with is, because resilience is kind of a new word. I mean, it's not a new word in our vocabulary, but it's a word that everybody's using now in various ways. So if you guys would just define or explain what, in the context of your work and what we're talking about today, what is it that we mean by resilience?
So we look at it from a standpoint is the ability to bounce back quicker. So that's from whatever. So when we are in considering community resilience, we are, and as a long-term disaster recovery organization, it's the ability to bounce back quickly from a disaster, and be it a climate-related disaster or, as we expanded our capabilities, a personal disaster, which could be, loss of a job or loss of some type of healthcare or not having insurance, those type of things.
And I'm actually going to try to shift the dial just a little bit. You've already heard me talk about, at least mention resilience to restoration. So yeah, I mean, God bless resilience. It's vital work and we're all doing it. And I got my undergrad at University of Alabama, but I'm a sports agnostic. So when I use a sports metaphor, you know that something serious is going down. Like the wise old coach says, you can't win if you play a purely defensive game. So you heard Cece and others talk about restoration work. So we want to shift the focus a little bit, not to de-emphasize resilience is vital, but to move us from resilience to restoration. And I can tell you more about that.
Okay, that's very interesting. I want to hear more about that. I do want to throw in another R word that one of the speakers that wasn't able to be with us today from Florida, Jessica, an estuary program over there. Yeah. Well, I talked to her. Cecile gave us her name, and she never was able to come even to the other. No worries. I had a good conversation with her, and she mentioned the word readiness. So is this sort of the same as resilience? There's sort of throw in readiness, explain a little bit about what that means in the context of, I think we can all generally see that, but.
Yeah. So I would, so I would say that those are very much related, and it's those things that you can do when we're not in crises that will put you at a state of readiness, such that if something happens, then you are resilient enough to be able to bounce back quickly. So it's very much related.
Okay. There's kind of a trajectory, I guess, of stages of that we're constantly in the cycle of crisis and restoration and readiness and resilience.
Right. See, I would have used readiness because that's a military term, right?
Okay,
and we think of in terms of military, we've always been in the state of readiness, and but I tried to make that transition to resilience. So I can go there.
No, we'll talk about resilience. I just wanted to be sure that got mentioned because she mentioned it to me, and I hadn't really thought about that in this context. So tell us, same kind of question as what we talked about with the ecosystems. Like, what are the big issues that you're dealing with regards to resilience and restoration with your work, and how does this relate to climate?
Okay. So I have to. I like, if I can, to give a little history of us, right, in Rebuild Bay. And I mentioned before that we were formed just to respond to Hurricane Michael and provide long-term recovery assistance. As we did that and learned how to do that as a new organization and learn from other organizations that were doing it already, we had all these other disasters that popped up. And we had part of our county that were very resilient, that had insurance, that was able to bounce back very quickly, but we had another large part of the community that just could not get there. And we were struggling with what was the issue there, because we had all of these resources available. And with these compound disasters, what we found was that there were resources that were available for recovery, but there was something missing, and that was that lack of access to resources for whatever reason. And so when we started looking more at community resilience versus just long-term recovery, because it also encompassed that. And what are those things that we needed to do to put our community in that state of readiness, and so that they are resilient to for any disaster that might come our way. Our governments were focused on the infrastructure, generally as they should be, but there was really no focus other than some of the community-based organizations on the people. And it takes people to be resilient. And so we started looking at what is this, how do we get there? So we looked at, when you look at community resilience, there are about 9 lifelines generally, and that's transportation, that's housing, that's education, training, communications, power. So all these things that we need to kind of look at individually to see what we can do to make those for our community to understand that a little bit better, to see what those barriers are to be able to be ready for the next thing. So if we just take housing, at the point of Hurricane Michael, 70% of the residents were renters and 30% homeowners. And you say, not a big issue. That is a big issue. Because when you have, and we found that it should be, you want it to go the other way, right? So when we had a lot of homes that were destroyed, homeowners generally could tap into their insurance, and those that were underinsured, there were some programs for that. Renters have very little recourse for a disaster because they don't own the home that they're living in. And what we found, that just an example, some of our apartment complexes took some major damage, but not complete destructions. Those owners, many of those owners took those complexes and they used that as an opportunity with insurance money or whatever to upgrade. And when they upgraded, the renters that were there prior to the hurricane could not afford to come back because now they're marketable at a higher rate. And so that left a large number of renters like out in the cold. And so you saw our homeless population just go through the roof almost. And so how do you get in front of that? So as we're talking about our working community resilience, how do you get in front of that? And that's looking at better jobs so that you can afford a better place to stay. That's looking at making housing affordable. And so all of those areas that, we try to address one by one that could serve as barriers for an individual household to be able to withstand something coming their way. Yeah, that's the question.
Yes, that was great. It was sort of how does resilient and you brought in affordability, which is a very important piece of this. That is not you can't extract that away from any of these things.
Right.
And then, how that relates to climate. So the storms that are happening. And when I think of resiliency, I think of New Orleans. I mean, who's more resilient than people in New Orleans? Because you've had so much happen. And I'm sure there's a lot going on. Hopefully we'll get a chance to maybe hear from some of the folks from New Orleans since we weren't able to get a speaker from there. But you can answer that question as well.
I want to add one thing about loans. We did have a lot of problems because in the African American community, oftentimes people just had a home, like a family home, and it was not the people. They were getting gone who had originally, so they had no paperwork. So they were not qualified to get any of the FEMA money. And this is why certain parts of the city never really came back, because they were not. It took many lawsuits and many years before the money finally came down to them. But certainly the importance of people keeping that and changing and putting their names on the property.
Yeah, so that's an issue called heirs property. I'm sure y'all know that. And it's a big issue in a lot of different contexts. We've dealt with that here in Alabama and communities that are trying to get septic systems installed in the Black Belt that haven't had proper sewer for years. And they have to own that land in order to get the system installed. And there is a wonderful resource out of Auburn University. Ryan Thompson is a professor there. And he has, I think, become one of the lead experts and community helpers on getting people, unwound from their heirs property issues. So that's a great resource we have here in Alabama for that.
Could you repeat the question before you answer it, please?
So, generally, the second question after we, or the first question after we mention resilience to restoration is, what do you mean by restoration? And so now I will backtrack and tell you a little more about this ALIPL, PJCC. I can't even say the acronyms. I didn't want to do a long soliloquy right at the beginning, but People's Justice Council is primarily working in the Gulf South right now for a reason I'm about to tell you. But my boss, Rev. Michael Malcolm, I wish he could be here today. He's a much more dynamic speaker than I am. He's really international. So I hope you get to hear Rev if you're not already familiar with my boss. Rev is executive director of both organizations. When Rev came to Birmingham from Atlanta, he really came to restart an inactive chapter of National IPL, National Interfaith Power and Light, which has had some unfortunate news lately that we can get into off record or off
recording.
not that it's controversial, it's just sad. But anyway, so ALIPL is both a chapter of National IPL and a program of People's Justice Council. But when Rev came over to do that, and that's how we met, because I've been involved with the former chapter, Rev knew he wanted to keep doing all his globetrotting work. So he started PJC, People's Justice Council, at the same time. And both organizations have gone gangbusters. One day we need to split them up, make ALIPL its own 501c3, but enough about that. Here's the similarities. Both organizations operate, as Cindy has said, at this nexus of energy, climate, and justice. And as you may have guessed, both organizations are interfaith, which is very important to us. Just talking about resilience, typically the first organization, NGO, that we get to know in a community is a local house of faith, because as y'all are almost certainly aware, local houses of faith are already acting as resilience centers in frontline communities and elsewhere. So we, like y'all, thankfully right now we're not tied up in the federal funding crisis, but we do get some kind of quasi-federal grant funding. In fact, a few years ago, what started Resilience to Restoration was a grant from the National Academies. So despite the name, this is not a federal organization, but closely related. National Academies, NASM, National Academies, plural, of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Well, we pitched this Resilience to Restoration idea, and we're quite frankly shocked when they said, we love it. We love working with local houses of faith. So to finally get around to answering Cindy's question, what does restoration look like for us? Our original reporting requirement or reporting framework to NASM used a 3E, a triple E framework. And y'all, I'm an academic geek, so I could get into oikos and all the Greek behind three words that y'all know very well: ecology, economy, and since we're interfaith, ecumenical. The Greek root oikos, think household, is the root of all three of those words. So this is all about good housekeeping when you get right down to it, good planet keeping at the local community level. And I won't get into the details, but that's kind of, to us, it looks like ecological restoration, the seagrass, the shorelines, economic elevation, because when you're dealing with a frontline community, there's no make frontline communities great again. It's elevation. We've got to take them to where they've never been through work around co-ops, for example, as part of the economic solution there. And then ecumenical, because since we're on record, I'll tamper it, but it's what we all know. It's the toxic theology that has gotten us into this place. Mm-hmm. And I'll stop there.
Okay, so now that we've defined the terms and heard a little bit more about your organizations overall, I'd like for you each to say, obviously don't want to give personal information, but put like a story or a specific, tell a little more specifics about what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Like I know there's no normal day, but like a specific project that is, part of these ideas that we're talking about, the resilience. And you talked a little bit about some of the specific disasters that you guys have been a part of, but but maybe a little more, bring it down a little more specific.
So right now we have, two main focus areas, and one is disaster services and one is housing and human services, human needs services. And under our disaster services, we serve as the county's lead for volunteer and donation management. That's an emergency support function that we report to the state emergency operations center for. And that's when something's coming our way, the state EOC activates and they kind of activate all of the emergency support functions, and we start doing our planning. So that's one area in disaster services. And the other part of that is long-term recovery. And we are still kind of in long-term recovery from Hurricane Michael. We're going on year 7 now, I believe. And the only reason I say, so we have residents that are still in some state of recovery. What we don't have is the funding. So that's why I say we're still kind of in long-term recovery, but the work that we're able to do is totally dependent on funding and the ability to get resources. So if there's something that we can do with like volunteer support or with other like local grants, then we try to do that. And so we do a little bit of that. We are in long-term recovery from tornadoes that we had that touched down in January 9th of last year. It did not hit the entire county, but we had the areas that it hit pretty bad. And so those individual families, we had about 100 or so families that were impacted. We still have a couple that just had very difficult situations that we are still working with. And we go through any means necessary, any means we can find resources to be able to address that. So that's what we're doing as far as disaster services. And what also falls under that is preparedness, and that's education and training about disaster preparedness. Our human and our housing and human needs, we do community cleanups. And we are still, because the beaches are nice in Panama City, so Panama City Beach, we still get quite a few volunteer groups or spring break groups coming down for the summer that while they're there, they'd like to do some type of service project. So we utilize that time to help homeowners or residents with like some of the keep up. We have homeowners that just cannot physically do some of the things around their homes that will put them in a problem with code enforcement. And so we don't want them to lose their home. So if we can put some volunteer support around that, we try to do that. So we do that. And then any other programs that we may have that will be beneficial to the community that is funded. So we had a private donation for air conditioning units as well as heaters. And so during the summer, we activate that program and we provide that at no cost to residents. And during the winter, we can provide heaters. We just, with this snow front, we had this snow that we had, which is uncharacteristic of our area. But we had 2 weeks in January that were extremely cold for our area. And we opened on behalf of the county, a warming center. And we addressed mostly the homeless population, but we did have residents that did not have sufficient heating in their homes, so we didn't turn anyone away. That was quite a big feat. We had quite a few folks that came in and took advantage.
Do you know about how many?
Absolutely. So the first week, we had 100 overnight guests. Wow. At one time, and so we ran that for 6 nights. At one time, we went up to about 66 in one particular night. That was the height that first week. But throughout that week, because we had folks come and go. So throughout that week, we had 100 overnight guests. The second week, which was the week that it snowed, we had 131 overnight guests, which means that we served more than that. And we had, at the height, we had 97 one night. And so we planned for a max capacity. Our suggested max capacity was 90. And so we exceeded that, and we just made do. So we did that the week of the snow for 5 nights. And we were running 24-hour operations. And so it sounds fairly simple, but it wasn't, because that takes volunteers. Yeah. So just going through that process of getting volunteers, getting meal sponsors, because we serve meals as well. Absolutely. So that's the kind of thing that we have led for the past 3 years on behalf of our county. our big project right now is, so we mentioned earlier that the resources are somewhere there. They're somewhere. And I don't think that there's a shortage of resources in this country. The access to resources is an issue. Many residents just don't know where to go. And so we have been fighting for the last pushing for the last 3 to 4 years to have a place where our residents can count on and say, this is where I can go to get help. And then we take that, we assess their needs, and then we try to make that connection. So just last October, we made it an agreement with the city of Panama City, one of their CRA districts, to take over management of an old school. It's one of the historic schools in the area that was woefully underutilized, to turn it into a community resilience center. So we are in the process, and I'm super excited, you can probably tell that, to standing up that a community resilience center, so that in a blue sky situation, when it's not storming, we can provide everyday services, and that's connecting to transportation sources, bill pay sources, housing sources, medical and health sources. And then in times of disaster, we can do emergency feeding, emergency sheltering. We've used that facility for emergency sheltering. Now, to do that designation as a community resilience center allows us to be able to go out and request resources for that purpose, so that we put the infrastructure at the place. We can do it. We have the space, but it would be better if we had the infrastructure in place. So like doing the shelter, we had, like I said, 131 folks that second time around. We lost water because the lines were so old. So we are wanting to go in and upgrade the facility so that it can do what we've been doing from there much better.
Very cool. So Resilience to Restoration is a 3-tiered program. We've got a national resource that's online, smartphone friendly, that anybody can access. We've got state hubs like ALIPL, or since we don't want to double dip, Gulf Coast Creation Care here in Alabama and throughout the Gulf South, Texas to Florida. But of course, we're really focused on frontline communities, the wonderful work like y'all are doing, Donna. And this is the stuff we love. And there's so many different examples out there. In fact, just to give a teaser for GCCC, what does a trail have to do with resilience and restoration? Ask one of these folk. I love, they've got a trail idea that's really innovative. But every community is different, because as y'all know, in frontline communities, we're not there to help them. We're there first to get to know them and listen, amplify the local community voice. They are the experts. They may not be able to tell you the chemical formula of what's going on, but they know what's going on. They are the experts. And then if asked, we attempt to match resources with needs. And we even got a micro grant from Climate Advocacy Lab to create, a toolkit based on, here's how a local community can create a local restoration plan that's tailored to their community. But what we found time after time as we get folks together and start listening first, then getting everybody talking, is it's almost like the old biblical allegory of loaves and fishes. A real miracle occurs where we find that this person over here has exactly the resources that this person over here needs. So yeah, some really miraculous things happen when you get community together and start talking. But again, to answer the question, let me tell you about one program. We're not shoving this down communities' throats, but if they're interested, we've got a program called We Rise, Weatherize Every Residence in the Southeast. And unfortunately, we chose the acronym before our technical director that Cindy happens to know very well. For our technical director says, I really prefer the term home energy renovation. So we really needed an HER, not a W in the acronym. But anyway, how do we weatherize every residence in the Southeast? A train the trainer approach is how we're trying to take this viral. And unlike everybody else that wants to sell you, more insulation or energy efficient windows, that's great if you can afford it. But when you're dealing with the frontline community, we got to start small. What's the biggest lever? Low cost caulk, foam, weather stripping. The first thing you do, it's like the old real estate joke. What are the 3 most important aspects of real estate, location, well, and the three most important aspects of home energy renovation is air seal, air seal, air seal. You plug the holes with low-cost foam, weather stripping, and you can reduce folks' energy bills. I hope I get a chance to talk about energy burn and energy efficiency later. No, well, I'll save that for another question. But yes, doing these low-cost practices with the train the trainer approach, we can weatherize every residence in the Southeast, and yeah, that's really exciting to us. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, we PJC gave Gulf Coast Creation Care, which is another organization I'm involved in, a grant or some grant money to do a program here, and I'll just tell y'all it's available. It's kind of stalled because we haven't had any interest. But it's a program where they bring a green builder down from he lives north of Birmingham. We work with churches. So how it works is if you have a church that wants an assessment on your building of how it needs to be air sealed, it's a win-win-win workshop. So it's like a 3 or 4 day workshop. We bring this green builder down. Your church sponsors it. They pay $1,000, and what they get out of that is their building assessed for what they need to do to air seal it to save 10 to 30% on their energy bills. So they get that assessment. The team, depending on how many volunteers you get to show up, starts working on the building, starts caulking and foaming and air sealing the building. So we usually don't get the total building done in that weekend, but you learn how to do it yourself so that the congregation over time can finish air sealing the building properly to get the energy savings that they need. And in the process, the homeowners that come to the workshop learn how to air seal their own homes so that they can get 10 to 30% off of their energy bills. And then we usually choose a low-income home also as a test site during the time that the workshop's going on, where we go and begin air sealing that home for a low-income person. So anyway, it's a little model that we've set up, and PJC helps us with it, and Gulf Coast Creation Care is willing to do it. If you know any congregations or pastors or churches who would like to sponsor one of those workshops, let me know.
Thank you, Rhoda.
Fun fact, my first job out of college was working for Appalachian Service Project in the Appalachian Mountains, weatherizing homes. So know those tricks. This was in 1997, 6, something like that. So those are very effective ways to lower energy bills, make things more affordable, and make people more resilient to what's coming our way with extreme weather. So the next question I have for you guys, and then we'll open it up to the audiences. And Cece, we may want to bring you back in on this one too, because I'm not sure. We talked about this a little bit with yours, but getting at what the league, how the league's involvement matters and how the league can get involved. What are the barriers that you're finding in your work? And I know funding is always a barrier to everything we do at nonprofits, but are there policy barriers? Someone mentioned heirs property, that's a barrier. Are there policy barriers? Are there things that that you are trying to do to open up more access to these things, and sort of start to weave into that question what you see maybe the league could partner with or support in those efforts?
Also, okay, add to the barriers that I have seen. One is this notion of this. Who's on first? And we have seen, getting someone to own it. Own the issue has and take point has been, and you wouldn't think it was that hard. And so we have, from a nonprofit standpoint, and this is what I've seen, and I always tell the folks in Bay County that I'm not from Bay County, and I don't do I don't do voice me. I like to do action, and there was this, I noticed this, there's an attitude amongst the nonprofits that the government is supposed to fix it. And then and they're supposed to provide all of the funding. And then there was an attitude or notion from the government that the community-based organizations are supposed to do all of the work. And And so they're doing this, like, you get it. Oh, no, you do it. You do it. You do it. And I'll just take as an example, the warming shelter. For 3 years, we have identified from our government standpoint and from our community-based organizations that when it gets cold, we need to have a place for folks to go. And it was like, well, who's going to do that? Who's going to do that? So we stepped up and we did it. We didn't have a plan. We didn't have a policy around it. We saw the need and we went to work. And the government wanted to dictate how it was going to be run and what was going to happen, but they didn't want to run it. They didn't want to fund it. Our community-based organizations are all up in arms and go, well, why isn't our government doing that? And at the end of the day, someone has to do it. So it took us 3 years, but now we have a plan, and I think that we have to show that it can be done, show how to do it, and then how everyone's interests can be met and everyone can participate in it. So just taking it on and running with it. So this finger pointing is not helpful, but we see a lot of that. The second thing is I struggle with how we make it matter when we're not in crisis. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of education and training, and just take the example of heirs property. We have so many people that are living in homes that they don't own. And so when something happens, everyone's like, oh, I need this, I need this, I need that. And they're not eligible because they don't own the home. But there are classes, there are workshops, there are training sessions that talk about how you take your home through probate, how you look at your documents, how you do estate planning. And we don't take advantage of those type of things because right now it doesn't matter to me. But when it matters, it's too late. Mm-hmm. The probate process can take years. Mm-hmm. And so, and you look at that in each aspect of life, and I think that folks kind of sit back. We still have folks that come in I can always tell that when we have someone coming in to request assistance, there's been a crisis, there's been some type of traumatic event in their life. And when someone calls and they say, hey, I need home repairs and I'm still recovering from Michael. Well, it's been 7 years. I try to understand what has happened between 2008 and 18 and now. And they got to a point where they kind of it was okay. And they started to live with it. But then something happened. And then it's like, oh, I still have a leaky roof. And so how do we make it matter so that we can do the planning and we can put the steps into place that will help us be more resilient when crisis hits. So I think that's an issue. So absolutely. Mm-hmm. It's hard for government to be proactive. and I agree with that. And I spent 25 years in the government. So, but yes.
Cece, did you want to?
Sure. Do you want to go first since your time for tonight?
Go ahead.
Some barriers I think this probably stands true for pretty much everyone, but I mean, the biggest barrier is that the people, with the influence, the power, and money are not the people who are experiencing the problems and noticing the problems. And so when we bring the problems to them, and how we bring the problems to them is really like how to overcome that barrier. And that's, we're going to ask that question at the end and answer that question at the end, right? So I won't get into that right here, but yeah, the barrier is that the people, the change makers, or I should say the policy makers, the elected officials, were the change makers, don't see the problems. Yeah, the ones who are making the decisions don't see the problems as what they are. I mean, and furthermore, especially as it affects the environment, but I mean, even with like, I mean, the health, I think there are a lot of corrupt officials. Which maybe shouldn't say them. Not naming anyone specific, but yeah.
I think we've been on.
We have a lot of and I can say this with confidence, and this is a public quote that the director of the Alabama Department of Environmental Management. His role, he sees it as serving industry, which is just sort of contrary to his role as the Director of Environmental Management. And so that's, in a field that exists to defend a natural resource, it is confusing when someone that is an entity that should help us do that is prioritizing supporting regulated industry, expediting permits, and making the permitting process easier. And our state already, is fast-tracked its course to be the highest chemical producer in the country. And like, that's a huge barrier to our success and to our health. But it's not just the Department of Environmental Management. That's also, there are other state departments that are prioritizing other things because, we, the change makers, need to bring the issues to the decision makers and make it something that they can see as a real problem.
And I'll add on to that, because yes, amen on that, that our legislators are also showing their prioritization of what they care about by what they fund. So they decide what the budget's going to be and what these agencies get funded. And the Alabama Department of Environmental Management is the lowest funded agency for the work that they do in the entire country.
And they brag about it.
And they brag about it because they brag about how efficiently their low cost service to the environment is. That is what our elected officials can show where their priorities are by funding certain agencies lesser or more than others. So, you want to talk about barriers?
Yeah, I'd just like to do a yes and to everything that's already been said and give you a very specific example. It's especially prevalent in Alabama, but it's prevalent throughout the Southeast. Energy burden. The way the definitions go, the most common one is generally if you pay 6% or more of your income, if 6% or more of your income goes to keep the lights on and the heater or cooling, depending on what season it is, running, you are considered energy burdened. More than 10%, you are considered energy impoverished. And y'all, guess what the average percentage rate for low income, for BIPOC folk is pretty much throughout the country. Any guesses?
20.
I'm happy to say not quite that high, but 15%. So well above, half again above energy impoverished is what the average poor BIPOC person in our country is paying. And y'all, it's especially bad in the Southeast. We know why. Southern Company. But TV, of course, just look at Alabama as a snapshot of this complicated panoply. We've got TVA, which used to be great, now not so good in a number of these areas. Alabama Power is probably the worst utility in the country for energy efficiency. And then you've got this really interesting play. Anybody here on a rural electric cooperative? Pay your utility bill to a rural electric cooperative? There's a really interesting interplay with these things that most folks don't know about rural electric cooperatives. Some of them are great. Unfortunately, a lot of them aren't. Despite being cooperative, they've drifted from the original cooperative mission. So just to focus on Alabama Power here, and I'm talking to a very select audience because usually I tell my audience the most important election y'all don't know about is our State Public Service Commission. But y'all are already on that. But it's not just the PSC because that's Alabama Power. It's here in Alabama, it's the stuff the PSC doesn't regulate, TPA, the rural electric co-ops and munis and so forth. But we have got to work on energy burden, which is We Rise and all that.
And that's interesting because, and I'm taking these numbers down because the determining affordable housing is 30%. Anything over than 30% of your housing costs that you're spending, 30% of your income is what your affordable housing should be within 30% of your income, right? So you shouldn't spend more than that. And if 15% is going to just energy, then that's already we're already getting it.
15% for utility bill.
Yeah, that's Interesting, because now you see where you get to folks paying
Yeah, it's-
50%
It's
of the
staying
income
expensive
for
to be
housing.
poor. Yeah.
Wow, yeah. Interesting.
We are gonna go to questions. Can I get a time check? Like how much time? Oh, we're
Let me-
supposed to be like 11:30.
We were going to,
Go to 12?
lunch starts at 12, so I would say probably cut it, what time is it? I would say we got another 20 minutes.
Okay, we're good. So I want to answer some questions from you guys, and then we do want to save time at the end for them to talk. If there are any more ideas about the league's involvement, I want to make sure we get to that. So.
I just want to, I think it's very, interesting what you said in Bay County, that when people got FEMA money, they upgraded their rental. And no problem with their rental property. I have no problem with that. But what I don't understand is why that money is given to them with no restrictions or obligations for the people who were displaced, because that's really what the money is for. You know, whether it was a time limit when you can increase the rent, or whether it is restrictions on what you can replace. You know, and I don't understand why that wouldn't be.
So if I understand your question, your question, you're asking about FEMA money being used for rental upgrades, and why is that the case versus using those funds for like displaced persons? I would like to make a correction. I am not aware that FEMA funds are used for rental properties. That was not an eligible use of any FEMA funds post Hurricane Michael.
My understanding was you said the owners
Correct.
of the property.
Right.
Not the money.
Right, that was insurance money. Insurance.
So it's not.
Right. I am not aware that FEMA funds are used for rental properties. That is something that was not you were outside of the criteria if you had a rental property.
Yeah. Thank you. That clarifies.
Okay.
Christy? So Christy from Louisiana, and I just wanted to put on the table some concepts that we discussed in our planning of this. And I know that Cecile Scoon in Florida shared my view about the importance of some of this. But I often say the main thing I do in life is read the news. And back in 2016, our then new, in his first year of administration, Democratic Governor John Bel Edwards, I read, was quoted as saying after the 2016 floods, we need to have some discussion about where we build and where people live. And I was never able to find that article again. I looked and looked, but that raised a big question for me. But then the article that I can find, because I'm looking at it, was about Grand Isle, which is our long barrier island that's been hit by hurricanes for perpetuity, and suffered particularly under Ida. But there's some candy-colored cottages and a marina that a millionaire from my part of the state, Lafayette, is building there. And the article goes into how they have big plans for development and $500,000 homes, and these people can self-insure. However, they have a problem because they found that the working class people who might service their daily activities couldn't afford to live on the island. And I read self-insure, but the article also talked about how they, actually have water and electrical structure that comes from the mainland, so they're not completely independent. But we are having, surreal and existential are most overused terms in our language now, but we are having in Louisiana what is called an existential crisis around insurance. And that's why we put coming home on our little flyer, because people are concerned that they can't afford to live in Louisiana anymore. And we are already a state that's hemorrhaging population. We had some discussion about how in Louisiana, the population has actually been drifting south toward the more the danger zone, whereas Alabama has top-heavy kind of northern development. So we're in a really odd situation in Louisiana where the population is moving to the most threatened areas. We have this insurance crisis, but some people can self-insure. So I do think it is an existential crisis for many people in our state, the state itself. And I just wondered if Alabama is having this, so we know it's happening in Florida.
Yeah, we did talk about insurance a lot in our planning. We didn't have I didn't know an expert on insurance that wasn't like someone that worked for an insurance agency. That might not be what we want to hear. I don't know. I don't know that Alabama's having these issues as bad as Florida and Louisiana. We are
the largest growing county in the United States right now.
Are insurance companies pulling out?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Even in Mobile where I live, our insurance.
Yeah, so I don't know if y'all, if you have anything to say about that or any expertise, or you want to talk about ideas for,
It's
not anything I have
that's
expertise
why we were talking about how to frame this issue. Of course, we believe on affect the environment for its own sake. But that question of how do you get to the legislators, how do you get to people, and it tends to be pocketbook issues like or insurance. So, how do we think about this and framing, we have positions on environment at the league and on meeting basic social needs at the league, and these are kind of convergent.
Yeah, it's a difficult issue, and I'll just I don't have a fix for it. I'll just make a couple of comments. So in Florida, our public insurance is closing down, and that was the insurance that was put into place, that was state run, to be able to take on those residents that could not afford private insurance. And that is a lot of policies are being closed out for that. So yes, it's a crisis. The other thing is just making points. So, and I don't know if this is here in the other states, but we have a hurricane deductible in Florida. And it is 2% of the value of the home. So even if you couldn't afford insurance when you bought the house, then we had folks that came to us for assistance that could not afford the 2% deductible in order to get to access the rest of the insurance policy for that. So that's another issue. And then if we look at it, our most vulnerable residents have older homes to where they have gone past their mortgage and they have elected to not get insurance. And in order to now get insurance, they have to do all these major upgrades to their homes to bring it up to code. And so they go, oh, well, I'm not going to do it. And so it's a big issue. There's different trends in there. And from a community-based organization standpoint, and we're looking at community resilience, we're going to have to think about what can we do to assist our residents to prepare for that. And I'm not really sure exactly what that is yet. And so we've been there's an article that came out over the last couple of days that talked more about that and gave some very alarming statistics about where Florida sits in from an insurance standpoint. And so we've been talking, a couple of us in our group, like, okay, so what do we do with that? How do we implement that in our community resilience programs? And I'm not sure yet, but we're going to start thinking and praying on that for sure.
One thing I do know that we talked about this in the planning too, and I apologize, I did not reach out. I didn't get a chance to reach out. Governor Ivey created something called a resiliency council at the state level. And one of the co-chairs of it is the head of the Alabama Insurance Department. And a lot of the members are business and insurance people. I don't know what their charge is. I don't know how they define resilience. But my understanding is it is, from just news articles I've read, it is something to do with, wanting to make sure insurance companies probably don't pull out of Alabama. Not necessarily like because they care about the people, but because they care about the insurance companies probably. But, making sure those things are available to people that they're trying to, get to either stay in Alabama or come into Alabama. I don't know anything about what they're doing, but that's probably something we could follow up with this and look into more.
I remember we were talking about there's a resiliency commission in Florida also, right?
I don't know.
That was what Cecile was saying. They just formed one in Alabama. And then had seen the one in Alabama, and then there's another one in Florida that Cecile had mentioned, which is.
From a policy standpoint, I think one thing that I'm a skeptic when it comes to at least Alabama government. So I think we could do our due diligence to figure out what it is they're doing, and also to make sure that that we're holding them accountable to not just think about the business side of this, but to think about the people side of this.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a small enough entity that we could engage with them. Yes.
I just think you have to understand that the state cannot compel companies to write insurance in this state. So if State Farm decides to pull out, or Allstate, the state has no power. These are private companies.
Right.
So all that's left is, will the state create an insurance mechanism? And I think as you get more and more of these natural disasters like the wildfires in California or the hurricanes, and the cost of self-insuring becomes prohibitive. So it is a very difficult problem.
It is.
And I'm skeptical that the state will find a solution. It's very, very difficult, given the number of disasters that have had huge insurance implications. That flooding in North Carolina was an enormous cost disaster for which insurance companies had no preparation at all.
Right.
They're not going to stay.
Right. It gets back to something you said earlier, Donna, about how do we make these decisions and make these things important when it's not a crisis? And I mean, we may be too late for that on discussions like this, but when we think about just if we were better at sitting at a table with a bunch of entities and having policy discussions and really trying to grapple with the real problems that people and communities are suffering, then figuring out answers. We've been in our whole lives where this is how insurance works. And now it may not work anymore. Right. And exactly. So in our whole lives and how this is how other things work and how much money the federal government and state governments put toward disasters is just going to have to grow and grow and grow. Unfortunately, it looks like we might be going in the wrong direction on that. And I don't know if that's people just freezing in crisis or people, or we're just not willing to really sit down and grapple with these things. There's a question back there.
So the threat of insurance companies leaving the state is something that's always elevated, but they will stay for auto insurance. And if you link that and say, okay, well, we're not going to allow you to write any auto policies if you're not going to write homeowner policies, then you put pressure on them. So they make a lot of money from auto policies. And if you tell them, hey, you pull out with home, we're not going to allow you to be here for auto policies, then you're able to put pressure on those companies as well.
Tweaking those levers that you have.
Exactly. Hey, Cindy, can I connect something that you just said, or that both of you have said? How do we make this a priority when we're not in crisis? Well, to me, when you've been talking about this resilience to restoration efforts are how we make it a priority when we're not in crisis. Because, and if I understood your program correctly, and that's one of the things, like living shorelines is an example in our case, implementing those restoration efforts helps us have those long-term solutions that help us be resilient throughout the easy and hard times. Excellent.
Sorry. I'm a great believer in self-sufficiency in communities. And I was interested in the comment that Cece made, where you're working to get communities to do the work so that you will no longer need to do it. What would a community look like that did that work that you need done?
Great question.
Will you repeat it?
Yes. So the question was, she said that she was interested in what it looks like for a community to be doing the work that, in this case, that Baykeeper does. What does it look like? At the beginning, for those of you who weren't here, I mentioned that part of our mission is, in defining water quality, we have a few indicators, and one of the indicators of good water quality is that the communities are taking responsibility and doing the work for water quality. And at that point, when all of our indicators are coming to fruition, including communities taking responsibility, then we can cease to exist. So to me, that looks like all of you and all of our communities that are living in these spaces, caring for one another, being good stewards of the water, of the bay, of the ecosystems, choosing things like living shorelines over things like hardened walls and shorelines, advocating for environmental policy that will support good water, healthy water quality, taking issues to the decision makers, saying something to your neighbors.
You would form a group with you?
I'm saying that the group is everyone. I'm saying that the communities, every single nonprofit exists because there's a problem. And it should ideally be the goal of every nonprofit to eventually solve that problem. So that is, the goal is that there will be such, synergy and collaboration around keeping water quality healthy in the bay and surrounding waterways, that everyone wants that sustainable, healthy bay, so that we don't have to
develop
continue
a watch plan for that for a community.
We do have a strategic plan, and we update it periodically.
No, I mean not for you, but for a community.
We have a few community organizers. One of them should be coming in later today. Does Shalila walk in as well? No. This is Carletta Davis, but she's one of our board members. But we have Shalila Davis, I think, is coming later today. And she's one of our community organizers. And so she's one of the people on our team who does go out and helps interact with communities and supports them to do the work, but also listens to them and understands how they need to have the work done, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
I'll touch on that as well. So again, from a community-based organization perspective, trying to do community resilience, we're talking about making those connections that will provide the awareness or give the community access to the awareness of those issues and how they can address those, providing a space and a place for the education around what that looks like and how they can help. And so just like I mentioned earlier, we are, as we think about community resilience and making those connections, we are partnering with our estuary programs to be able to tell that story. We want to implement those in our youth programs. The National Academies of Sciences and NASM that was mentioned, they have a grant program that is designed for community-based organizations to engage the community and think about how to help that in their normal planning. So can we do, if we're having STEM programs or we're having other youth programs, how do we connect them to those type of issues so that their projects that we're bringing them together anyway. So now let's give them projects that will help them learn about living shorelines, and they can touch and feel, and we just incorporate that into that learning. And then it also not only makes them aware, but we're growing this next generation of more community resilient individuals. And so how do you bring the community in? You got to first make them aware and then provide the opportunities for them to engage in that and show them what that looks like.
I think our awareness efforts in Sarasota County are not really being effective. I may be wrong. I'll check with our county sustainability person, but we've been trying to educate for a long time, and you're just not getting the response. People are too interested in their lives to be educated about suctivity and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It's hard.
We gotta make it matter.
I think we all have the experience of it until it hits you in your home, right, in your family, in your backyard, whatever it is. That awareness stuff is really hard. And but it's also hard to see the impact of it. So it's just this constant drumbeat, and I have to believe it's having some impact. We wouldn't be here, right? We would all be somewhere having a hard drink. Maybe we'll do that later. So I think we're winding up on our time. We didn't quite get to real specifics of what LEAD can do, but we're going to talk a lot about that in the afternoon session, taking all of this great information that we got from the speakers and all the issues that came up. And there may be some that we didn't cover that you want to throw in the mix after lunch when we have small group discussions, and hopefully we can narrow this down to some tangible pieces that the LEAD can run with on looking at our positions and our activities going forward. So thank you all very much.